In traditional team sports, rivalries are built over years of constant competition with one another, i.e. the long-lasting animosity between the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox. Fans of either team by default hate each other and act accordingly when it's game time. The Los Angeles Lakers and the Boston Celtics have been the subject of endless debates as the bi-coastal showdowns trace back to the beginning of the NBA. The athletes in combat sports don't exactly have that much time to establish these sort of feuds. Where teams can meet each other multiple times in a single season, fighters typically only ever do so once, and only in special cases does that change. If a fight is surprisingly exciting, ends controversially, or is completely inevitable, then they might get the chance to run it back, and it's hard not to get excited heading into those rematches. With the fighters and camps having more time to pick apart one another and more bad vibes to slap across in a promo, it's hard not to buy into the rematch hype, but us fight fans don't deserve nice things and the results can be underwhelming. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, here with our channel Hall of Famers. Huge thanks to the biggest channel supporters, and these are 10 huge rematches that sucked. Number 10, Robbie Lawler versus Nick Diaz 2. Nick Diaz's knockout of Robbie Lawler at UFC 47 still stands as one of the most unexpected outcomes in the sport. In the years that followed, fans begged to see it again, but even though they both found themselves fighting on the same cards in other promotions, it just didn't get done. And by the time they were back on the UFC roster, their diverging career paths kept them apart. While Lawler was pinning his title run and career comeback fairy tale, Diaz was enjoying his cult icon status and leveraging his way into big fights regardless of merit. Just when we finally accepted the fact that the Stockton native was comfortable staying outside of the octagon and that Lawler's best days were behind him, the UFC announced the rematch. That main card bout at UFC 266 lacked pretty much everything we loved about the first one. This was far from the style clash between two young prospects. Instead, we saw a man fresh off a 6.5-year layoff and in comparatively poor shape get beaten by a shop-worn vet. Fortunately for Lawler, his frequency of activity aided him in easily walking down Diaz and unloading at will. While the opening round provided some of the intangibles you'd expect from Diaz, it wasn't enough to pick up a win or even be competitive. Just like the rematch itself, his presence felt random, unnecessary, and way too late. Number 9, George St. Pierre versus BJ Penn 2. The Prodigy's run as the UFC lightweight champion was undeniably great, and after wiping the floor with Jens Pulver, Joe Stevenson, and Sean Shirk, Baby J was once again feeling ambitious on the scale and wanted to test himself against the best of the welterweight division yet again. Although he was finished in his rematch against Matt Hughes, his previous outing against George St. Pierre was much more successful. Even though he'd walked away with an L, the split decision meant that it was at least competitive and had some success to draw from with another opportunity. Namely, his striking looked very effective and he managed to bust up the Canadian. GSP next dethroned Matt Hughes and began his own dominant championship run. So at UFC 94, BJ would enjoy some extra carbs and set his sights on a super fight. However, this time there would be no question who was the better fighter. GSP smothered Penn against the fence, outstruck him, and overpowered him with wrestling. It wasn't even close and damn sure wasn't much fun either. Outclassed and overwhelmed, Penn's corner made the decision that it wasn't going to go to the death, but end before the final round began. Number 8, Demetrious Johnson versus John Dodson 2. The pairing of Demetrious Johnson and John Dodson was stylistic perfection. At UFC on Fox 6, Dodson's explosive power, lightning speed, and wild approach was the perfect contrast to Mighty Mouse's blend of athleticism, calculation, and technical proficiency. While Dodson was able to drop DJ twice in the second round, the champion would overcome to employ his game and win the unanimous decision. The losing challenger took the lessons to heart and finished 2 of his next 3 fights to find himself right back in the cage against DJ. By this point, Mighty Mouse was barely breaking a sweat, dominating in his next 5 defenses, but there was little doubt that a rematch between them would yield similar results to the first fight and give us some compelling moments, since at that point, Dodson had proved to be his toughest test. But at UFC 191, their reunion would look nothing like the first time. Despite Dodson's best efforts to replicate what worked previously, DJ was more than prepared. Instead of playing into a contest of athletic feats and speed, the champion slowed things down and rendered his opponent completely ineffective. An exhausted and outdone Dodson looked totally out of his element en route to another decision loss. Number 7, Tito Ortiz versus Ken Shamrock 2. The simmering feud between Tito Ortiz and Ken Shamrock came to a head at UFC 40, when in his 5th defense of the light heavyweight title, the Huntington Beach Bad Boy was able to put the former Superfight champion away via doctor stoppage. What preceded the finish was a dominant performance from Ortiz, but what followed was Dana and the Fertittas counting the stacks of cash the event brought in and determining that by hell or high water, the team punishment and Lions Den beef would have to resurface in some way. The opportunity presented itself as the Ultimate Fighter was moving into Season 3. The same pro wrestling fans that tuned in the first time on the strength of Shamrock's name would be tempted to tune in as the rivals coached against one another leading into another fight on pay-per-view. The hype machine managed to spin Shamrock's lone moment of success from the opening round of their first fight into enough promo material, and it was on. Unsurprisingly, this was even less competitive. Ortiz had no trouble taking him down and landing ground and pound. However, a perceived early stoppage from Herb Dean disrupted the carnage fans came to witness in just 1:18 of the first round. The boos took over the Mandalay Bay Event Center as guest commentator Randy Couture led the champion through an awkward post-fight interview that opened the door for yet another unnecessary meeting. An immediate rematch a few months later gave us more one-way traffic, but at least this time it was free on Spike TV and there was no controversy about the finish. Number 6. Fedor Emelianenko versus Minotauro Nogueira 2. Fedor's decision win over Big Nog at Pride 25 marks one of the most important moments in MMA history. Not only did it crown Fedor as champion on his way to becoming a GOAT candidate, it also ended the title reign of Big Nog and established the hierarchy for the rest of the heavyweights competing at the time. So imagine the level of excitement surrounding the two best in the world meeting again in the final round of the Pride 2004 Heavyweight Grand Prix. Nogueira had not only remained undefeated during the year and a half between, but he had also picked up an interim title in the 2003 Fight of the Year against Mirko Cro Cop. Much like they did before, the two engaged immediately upon the opening bell, with Emelianenko's sambo skills matching up well against Nogueira's legendary BJJ game. Submission attempts, ground and pound, positional battles, it was a grappler's paradise for 3 minutes and 52 seconds. That's when an accidental head clash opened up a nasty cut over Fedor's right eye. Despite the best efforts of the ringside medical staff, the promotion, and Fedor himself, the injury was deemed too serious to continue, forcing a no contest and sucking the air out of the Saitama Super Arena. Number 5. Chris Weidman versus Anderson Silva 2. When Chris Weidman knocked out Anderson Silva to become the middleweight champion at UFC 162, he upset odds makers and created one of the most enduring moments in the sport. We all remember where we were when the Spider fell to the floor lifeless after taunting the young challenger. There were obvious questions remaining though. Could Silva get the job done if he hadn't been playing games in the octagon? Was Weidman just lucky that night? Had age caught up to Silva? Would he respond to his first loss in the UFC with a renewed sense of ferocity? We hoped to get definitive answers at UFC 168. Needless to say, the hype for their immediate rematch was off the charts, and you simply couldn't escape that god-awful commercial for weeks. We watched Anderson approach Weidman without the mind games, but we also watched the new champion respond with force. After a strong first round for Weidman, it appeared that Silva found some level of success toward the end. Just as a true striking contest began to emerge in the second, a checked kick broke Silva's leg and handed him his second straight loss. It was another bizarre ending that left everyone feeling empty. Number 4. Vitor Belfort versus Randy Couture 2. When Captain America and the Phenom first met, it was marketed as a heavyweight super fight and number 1 contender bout. Belfort was drawing comparisons to Mike Tyson with his fast hands and frightening ability to put his opponents to sleep. But while he impressed in his 4 fights, would his power and athletic ability be enough to take on the strategic genius and wrestling ability of Randy Couture? The question would be answered at UFC 15 when Couture would TKO the Phenom just over 8 minutes into the contest. In the 6 years that followed, Randy would become a multiple-time champion in 2 divisions, and Vitor would win 7 of his next 10, adding more memorable finishes to his accomplishments. With Couture's light heavyweight title on the line, the more experienced version of both men would serve as an exciting main event for UFC 46. The collective breath of the MMA world was being held, waiting to see what would happen when punches were thrown, and the very first of those punches from Vitor grazed Couture's eye, opening a cut with the seam of his glove. The cage-side doctor took a brief look and called for the anticlimactic end, which meant Belfort was the new king of light heavyweight. Fortunately, after surgery and a quick turnaround, Couture was good to go for a third meeting just 6 months later. Number 3. Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Thompson 2. While most will remember UFC 205 as the night Conor McGregor was crowned a double champion after an all-time great showing against Eddie Alvarez, Fight of the Night honors went to the welterweight title fight between Tyron Woodley and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. The combination of Woodley's power striking and forceful wrestling with Wonderboy's flashy and effective karate made for a violent ballet of momentum swings and jaw-dropping moments. When the bout was declared a draw, it guaranteed that the two would have to do it all over again. Just 4 months later, the pair was picked to headline UFC 209 and expected to pick right back up where they left off. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what happened. Before the weigh-ins, the UFC announced that the highly anticipated co-main event between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson was called off, leaving a huge void for the fans. Perhaps a repeat of their first encounter would have made things better though, but instead Woodley and Thompson, who were now well aware of how dangerous the other was, played it very safe and were light on offense. With both looking for opportunities to counter, the rematch became a slow and tedious affair, leading to another majority decision for the champion. Number 2. Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza 2. The best thing about the second fight between Rose Namajunas and Carla Esparza is that it makes for great subject matter on videos like this. We've talked about how it was so bad that it enraged the crowd. We've mentioned it among the most bizarre title wins. But what we haven't talked about is this fight being enjoyable or even mildly entertaining. That's because it's perhaps the most painfully boring fight to ever take place in the octagon. While Esparza wasn't exactly known for consistently putting on exciting fights, her previous TKO win was uncharacteristically violent. And since their original matchup in the UFC's first strawweight title fight, Thug Rose racked up more than her fair share of highlight reel moments. So there was hope for something, but all those hopes would be shot down in epic fashion as the two would do next to nothing in front of each other. The commentators had virtually nothing to talk about in regards to what was going on in front of them, and the good folks of Phoenix who just witnessed Michael Chandler head kick Tony Ferguson and were anxiously awaiting the surefire bloodbath between Charles Oliveira and Justin Gaethje were just left to check their watches and boo. But the worst part about the co-main event of UFC 274 is that Ant Walker has to keep writing about it. Number 1, Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock 2. Longtime MMA fans can remember a time when the uninitiated would dismiss the sport for the possibility of slow-paced grappling. In their defense, it certainly isn't the most enjoyable thing for most spectators. Take that back! That mentality still exists to some degree today, as we can still hear some jeers and disappointed sighs from the crowd during long wrestling exchanges. A lot of that ill will can be traced back to the rematch between Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock. Royce's submission win over Shamrock in less than a minute at UFC 1 went a long way into building his legend along with the martial art his family pioneered. The two parted ways and racked up wins, with Royce winning 2 more UFC tournaments and Shamrock becoming the first King of Pancrase. Fans wanted to see more, and so at UFC 5 the promotion would make the first ever super fight, a title that was the precursor to the divisional ones we know today. With no tournament shenanigans to interfere, it looked like there would be nothing but good old-fashioned fighting. Or maybe not. Instead of another showcase of the submission prowess of the skinny Brazilian, or a revenge-driven Shamrock overpowering his opposition, we got a 36-minute stall fest. Royce was unable to work his offensive guard, and Shamrock was neutralized from doing any significant damage. Worse yet, without judges, it was declared a draw. So not only was it terribly boring, it had no real conclusion. And while we could have easily added Shamrock's rematch to Dan Severn to this list as well, the threat of a felony arrest would make most people a bit hesitant. A huge shout out to the writer of this list, Ant Walker, the editor of this video, Max Randall, and Ben Rosette for the soundtrack. Please follow all these men on their social medias. Also, a big thank you to our channel champions. If you love our channel and want even more exclusive content or want to have a voice in helping to create videos, consider becoming a member by clicking join below the video. Which rematch sucked ass for you? Let us know in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys on the next one.